What would you do if you saw someone being unfairly judged based on their appearance? Snoop Dogg takes on this question with a powerful social experiment that sheds light on prejudice and accountability. This story will make you question everything. Hit like, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts on this groundbreaking moment. The sun hung low over Harmony Square Park, its golden rays filtering through the thick canopy of oak trees that lined the winding paths. It was a calm afternoon, the kind of day where people strolled lazily, children chased each other near the fountain, and joggers moved in rhythmic strides around the perimeter. Nestled in a corner of the park on a worn wooden bench sat a figure that many would overlook, or intentionally avoid. Snoop Dogg, the iconic rapper and activist, was unrecognizable. His signature braids were hidden beneath a frayed hoodie, its fabric faded from time and wear. His jeans, patched and slightly too short, hung loosely over mismatched sneakers. A crumpled brown paper bag rested beside him, its contents a mystery to passers-by. With his hood pulled low over his face, Snoop blended seamlessly into the background, a deliberate decision for the experiment he was about to undertake. He wasn't here as the celebrated music legend or philanthropist. He was here to observe, to experience firsthand the treatment society, and particularly law enforcement, reserved for the marginalized. His plan was simple: blend in, remain calm, and let the world reveal itself. As the afternoon unfolded, Snoop sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. Parents laughed with their children, couples walked hand in hand, and a group of teenagers sprawled out on the grass nearby, their voices carrying the carefree energy of youth. No one paid him much attention at first, and that was exactly what he wanted. Then the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the park's tranquility. A black and white police cruiser rolled into the nearby lot, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Two officers stepped out, their boots hitting the ground with purpose. One was a younger officer, Blake Moore, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to his sharp, scrutinizing eyes. The other, Jim Daniels, was older and stockier, his posture slightly weary but his gaze alert. Snoop noticed them immediately but didn't move. Instead, he leaned back on the bench, his posture relaxed, his hands resting casually on his lap. He didn't need to do anything. Experience had taught him that sometimes just existing was enough to draw attention. The officers scanned the park, their eyes sweeping over the families and joggers. It didn't take long before they zeroed in on Snoop. Moore nudged Daniels, nodding toward the bench. "Another vagrant?" Moore muttered, the disdain in his voice clear. "This park is turning into a camp for them." Daniels glanced at Snoop but didn't share Moore's immediate judgment. "Maybe he's just sitting," he said, his voice measured. "Not everyone's causing trouble." "Right," Moore replied, already striding toward the bench. "Let's find out." Their boots crunched against the gravel path as they approached. Snoop remained still, his eyes now fixed on the officers. He could feel the tension building in the air, the weight of assumptions already hanging over the interaction. "You can't sit here all day," Moore said sharply, stopping a few feet away. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried the clipped authority of someone used to giving orders. "What are you doing here?" Snoop looked up slowly, meeting Moore's gaze. His expression was calm, his voice even as he replied, "Just eating my lunch." Moore's eyes flicked to the brown paper bag beside Snoop, his suspicion evident. "This is a public park," Moore continued, his tone hardening. "Not your personal lounge. You got somewhere to go?" Snoop picked up the paper bag, unwrapping it to reveal a simple sandwich. He took a bite, chewing deliberately before answering. "Didn't know there was a time limit for sitting in a park." Daniels shifted uncomfortably beside his partner. "Blake," he murmured. "He's not doing anything wrong." Moore ignored him, stepping closer. "What's your name?" he demanded. Snoop paused, setting his sandwich back into the bag. "Calvin," he said after a moment, his voice calm but firm. "Calvin Broaddus." Moore's lips curled into a smirk. "Calvin Broaddus, huh? You got ID on you, Mr. Broaddus." Without a word, Snoop reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a worn wallet. He handed it to Moore, who flipped it open with a practiced motion. The ID looked legitimate, but the skeptical officer frowned as he studied it. "Doesn't match the look," Moore muttered, handing the ID back. "What are you really doing here?" "I told you," Snoop replied, his voice unwavering. "Just having lunch." Daniels stepped forward, his tone quieter but firm. "Blake," He's not bothering anyone. Let's move on. But Moore wasn't ready to let it go. People like him make the place look bad, he snapped. You scare off families, tourists. That's enough, Daniels cut in, his voice sharp for the first time. He turned to Snoop, his expression apologetic. You're free to go. Snoop stood slowly, his full height towering over the officers. As he adjusted his hood, a faint smile played on his lips, not mocking, but knowing. Thanks for the chat, he said, picking up his paper bag. As he walked away, Moore glared after him, his jaw tight. You see the way he looked at me? He muttered to Daniels. Guy thinks he's better than us. Daniels sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Let it go, Blake. He's not worth it. Snoop's footsteps were steady as he disappeared down the path, his faint smile growing as he rounded the corner. The first step of his experiment had gone exactly as expected. The late afternoon sun cast golden hues over Harmony Square Park, but the air was thick with tension. Snoop Dogg had moved to another area of the park, choosing a shaded bench beneath a cluster of ancient oak trees. The calm rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds created a serene backdrop, but Snoop's mind was far from at ease. The live stream on his phone had continued uninterrupted, capturing every moment of his prior encounters with the officers. Comments poured in, a mix of outrage, encouragement, and curiosity about how the situation would unfold. The peace was short-lived. The familiar rumble of the black and white police cruiser echoed through the park's gravel path. Snoop glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable as he saw Officers Moore and Daniels step out of the car once more. Daniels appeared reluctant, his steps hesitant as he followed his partner. In contrast, Moore's stride was purposeful, his face tight with frustration. There he is again, Moore said under his breath, his hand resting on his belt, still hanging around. Blake, Daniels said cautiously, his voice tinged with warning. We've already done this. Let it go. Not a chance, Moore shot back. This guy's hiding something and I'm going to find out what it is. Snoop remained seated as the officers approached, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. The crowd from earlier had dissipated, but a few passers-by lingered in the distance, their curiosity reignited by the officers' return. Back for round two? Snoop asked, his tone calm but edged with quiet defiance. You're not making this easy on yourself, Moore replied sharply, stopping a few feet from the bench. I told you to move along. And I told you, Snoop countered, his voice measured. It's a public park. I'm not breaking any laws. Moore's jaw clenched. Let's see some ID. Again. Daniels sighed, stepping forward. Blake, we already ran his ID earlier. It didn't lead anywhere. Exactly, Moore said, turning to his partner. That's suspicious. No records? It's either fake or he's hiding something. Or it's just an error, Daniels suggested, his tone growing impatient. It happens. Moore ignored him, his focus locked on Snoop. Hand it over. Snoop complied without hesitation, pulling the worn wallet from his coat and handing it to Moore. The younger officer examined it again, his brow furrowing as if trying to will the ID into revealing a hidden truth. Nothing's changed, Snoop said evenly. Still the same ID. Still me. Moore's frustration boiled over. Why don't you have a record? No address? No employment history? Nothing about you adds up. Daniels stepped in, placing a firm hand on Moore's arm. Blake, enough. You're reaching. This isn't worth it. But Moore shrugged off his partner's hand, his voice rising. You think this guy's clean? Look at him. Sitting here like he owns the place, giving us attitude. Something's off, and I'm not walking away until I figure out what. Snoop leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor unbroken. You're working real hard to prove something, officer. The question is, to who? The remark hit its mark, Moore's face flushing with anger. He stepped closer, looming over Snoop, his hand hovering near his baton. Daniels quickly moved between them, his voice firm. Back off, Blake, Daniels said. He's not armed. He's not causing trouble. You're the one escalating this. The tension between the officers was palpable, their disagreement drawing the attention of nearby onlookers. A cyclist stopped to watch, his phone discreetly aimed at the scene. An elderly woman walking her dog paused, frowning at the officers as she stood a safe distance away. Moore pointed at Snoop. Fine. You want to play games? Let's see what you're hiding. He pulled out his radio and pressed the button. Dispatch, this is Officer Blake Moore, requesting a deeper background check on a suspect. Name, Calvin Broadus. ID provided earlier. The radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cool and professional. Copy that, Officer Moore. Stand by. Daniels threw up his hands, his frustration evident. Blake, you're turning this into a circus. No, Moore snapped. I'm doing my job. Snoop watched the exchange silently, his gaze moving between the two officers. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but cutting. Funny thing about power, it shows who you are. And right now, you're showing everyone. The comment sent a ripple of murmurs through the small group of onlookers. Moore ignored them, his focus entirely on the radio in his hand. The seconds stretched into an uncomfortable silence, the tension thick enough to cut. The radio crackled again. Unit 12, no records found for the provided ID. Moore's face darkened, his frustration reaching a boiling point. What do you mean, no records? Check again. Records have been checked, the dispatcher replied, their tone firm. No matches found. Suggest verifying ID validity on site. Daniel stepped forward, his voice sharp. There. It's done. Let it go, Blake. Moore's grip tightened on the radio, his knuckles white. He turned to Snoop, his eyes narrowing. This isn't over? Snoop tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. It never is. Daniels grabbed Moore's arm, pulling him back. We're leaving. Now. As the two officers retreated to their cruiser, Moore cast one last glare over his shoulder. Snoop watched them go, his calm demeanor unshaken. Once the cruiser disappeared down the park path, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, checking the live stream. The comments had exploded. This is hard to watch. That officer is out of control. Snoop's composure is everything, teaching a masterclass in patience. Why do they keep harassing him? He's not doing anything. Snoop read the comments quietly, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. The game was unfolding exactly as he had planned. As he leaned back on the bench, the faint murmur of the gathered crowd continued to buzz around him, their support growing with each passing moment. This wasn't just a test, it was a mirror, and the reflection was becoming impossible to ignore. Inside the police cruiser parked nearby, Officer Blake Moore sat rigidly, his jaw tight and his fists clenched. The events of the day replayed in his mind like a maddening loop, Snoop's calm responses, the crowd's murmurs of disapproval, and his partner Daniel's growing discontent. To Moore, this wasn't just a case of some vagrant in a park. It was personal. He's toying with us, Moore muttered, his eyes fixed on Snoop through the windshield. You saw the way he looked at me. He's got something to hide. Officer Jim Daniels sighed heavily from the driver's seat, his patience wearing thin. Blake, we've been at this all day. He's not breaking any laws. Let it go before you make things worse. But Moore shook his head, his determination unwavering. I can't. Something's not right. He's too calm, too sure of himself. Daniels glanced at his partner, his expression a mix of frustration and pity. You're making this about your ego. This isn't about him. It's about you. The words struck a nerve, but Moore refused to acknowledge them. Instead, he flung the cruiser door open and stepped out, his steps purposeful and his jaw set. Daniels sighed again, but didn't follow. Moore approached Snoop with the air of a man ready to prove himself. His hand rested on his baton, his movements deliberate and heavy. Snoop noticed him coming, but didn't move. He sat upright, his hands resting calmly on his lap, as if anticipating the moment. Still here, Moore said, his tone low and clipped. Guess you like pushing your luck. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Just enjoying the fresh air. Moore took a step closer, looming over Snoop. Cut the act. I know you're up to something. Snoop met Moore's glare with steady eyes. You've been saying that all day. Still waiting for you to figure out what it is. The subtle challenge in Snoop's voice made Moore's fists clench. His composure, already fraying, began to unravel. Don't play games with me, he snapped. You think you're smarter than me? Better than me? Snoop didn't flinch. I don't think anything. I just know I've got nothing to hide. At that moment, Snoop reached into the pocket of his coat. Moore's hand flew to his baton, his body tensing as if ready for a confrontation. Don't even think about it, he barked. Snoop paused, his movements deliberate and slow. Relax, he said calmly. It's just my phone. He pulled out a sleek black smartphone, its screen glowing faintly in the dimming light. Moore frowned, his suspicion deepening. What's that for? Snoop smirked faintly, tilting the screen toward Moore. This, he said, is a live stream. Moore's confusion turned to shock as he realized what he was looking at. The screen displayed a video feed of their interaction. Snoop, seated calmly on the bench with Moore standing over him. Below the video, thousands of comments poured in, scrolling so fast they were barely readable. This officer is losing it. Snoop is exposing the system. Respect. They're harassing him for no reason. Moore's face flushed red as he fully grasped the situation. You've been recording this? He demanded, his voice rising. Not just recording, Snoop replied. Streaming. Millions of people are watching right now. Moore stumbled back a step, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. He looked around, noticing for the first time the small but growing crowd that had gathered again. Their phones raised as they captured the unfolding scene. You can't do this, Moore stammered, his voice trembling with anger and panic. You're setting me up. I didn't set you up, Snoop said, his tone calm but firm. I gave you a choice. Every action you've taken, every word you've said, that's all you. Moore's composure crumbled further as he struggled to find an out. This is entrapment. It's illegal. It's not entrapment, Snoop replied evenly. I didn't ask you to harass me. You made that decision all on your own. As Moore's panic reached a boiling point, Officer Daniels finally intervened. He stepped between his partner and Snoop, his expression weary but resolute. That's enough, Blake, he said. You're digging yourself into a hole you can't climb out of. Moore turned on his partner, his frustration boiling over. You're just going to let him get away with this? Get away with what? Daniels shot back. Sitting on a bench, eating a sandwich? He's not the problem here. You are. The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Moore's face twisted with a mix of anger and humiliation, but he said nothing. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their support for Snoop clear. A middle-aged man in a leather jacket called out, "This guy's exposing the truth. You can't handle it, can you?" A younger woman near the front added, "We see you, officer, and we're not impressed." The voices of the crowd grew bolder, their collective condemnation washing over Moore like a tidal wave. Daniels placed a hand on his partner's shoulder, his voice firm but quiet. "We're leaving." Moore hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. Finally, he nodded stiffly, his face a mask of defeat. The two officers turned and walked away, the crowd parting to let them pass. The sound of their retreating footsteps was drowned out by the applause and cheers that erupted around Snoop. As the officers disappeared, Snoop remained seated on the bench, his phone still in hand. He glanced at the live stream, reading some of the comments with a faint smile. This is how you make change happen. Snoop Dogg just schooled the system. Accountability starts here. He raised his gaze to the crowd, his calm demeanor unchanged. This isn't just about me, he said, his voice carrying over the applause. It's about all of us. We deserve better. The evening sun bathed Harmony Square Park in a golden glow, but the tension in the air was palpable. The small crowd gathered near Snoop Dogg's bench was now a full-blown assembly. Smartphones captured every angle and murmurs of anticipation rippled through the group. They weren't just watching, they were witnesses to a moment that felt bigger than themselves. The hum of authority broke through the noise as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the edge of the park. The door opened, and a commanding figure stepped out. Captain Jane Monroe of the Harmony Police Department's Internal Affairs Division was a striking presence, her sharp navy suit immaculate, her stride confident. She was the kind of leader who didn't need to shout to command respect. Her arrival immediately shifted the energy in the park. She approached Snoop Dogg still seated on the bench, her sharp gaze taking in the scene, the crowd, the officers, and the palpable tension. Her attention landed on Officer Blake Moore, whose face was flushed with frustration and thinly veiled panic. Behind him, Officer Jim Daniels stood with his arms crossed, his expression one of quiet resignation. "Captain Monroe," Daniels said with a respectful nod, "thank you for coming. Monroe's eyes flicked to Daniels before settling on Moore. "I didn't think I'd be called to intervene in something like this, Daniels. Explain." Before Daniels could respond, Snoop stood, towering slightly over the captain, his calm demeanor radiating quiet strength. "I think the footage speaks for itself," he said, holding up his phone. The live stream, still rolling, had reached millions by now. Thousands of comments scrolled across the screen, condemning the officer's behavior and praising Snoop for his bravery. Monroe's lips pressed into a thin line as she glanced at the phone. "Footage?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Snoop handed her the device without hesitation. The crowd grew silent, their collective breath held as Monroe reviewed the live stream. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the recorded interactions between Snoop and the officers. The aggressive tone of Officer Moore, the calm defiance of Snoop, and the murmurs of the crowd, all of it painted a damning picture. After a few minutes, Monroe handed the phone back to Snoop. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone carried the weight of authority. "I've seen enough." She turned to Moore, her gaze sharp enough to cut through his flimsy defense. "Officer Moore," she said, her voice cold and steady. "Hand over your badge and weapon." Moore's eyes widened in disbelief. "Captain, wait, this isn't fair. He set us up." "Set you up," Monroe repeated, her tone dripping with incredulity. "The only thing he did was sit on a bench. Your behavior is what turned this into a spectacle." Daniels stepped forward, his voice hesitant but resolute. "She's right, Blake. We didn't have a reason to keep escalating this." Moore's face flushed deep red, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but the strength in his voice was gone. He unhooked his badge from his uniform and placed it in Monroe's outstretched hand. Then, with visible reluctance, he removed his holstered weapon and handed it over as well. "You're on administrative leave pending a full investigation," Monroe said curtly. "Consider this your formal notice." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their voices filling the park. Some shouted words of encouragement to Snoop, while others directed their anger at Moore. The officer stood there for a moment, frozen in humiliation, before turning and walking away toward the cruiser. Daniels watched him go, a mix of relief and regret on his face. Monroe turned to the gathered crowd, her voice cutting through the noise. "To everyone here, I want to personally apologize on behalf of the Harmony Police Department. This behavior is unacceptable and does not represent the standards we hold ourselves to. Rest assured, there will be accountability." The crowd murmured in approval, their anger beginning to shift into hope. Snoop stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "It's not just about one officer," he said, addressing Monroe and the crowd simultaneously. "It's about the system that allows this to happen. We need more than apologies. We need change." Monroe met his gaze, her expression softening slightly. "I hear you," she said, "and I promise to do my part. But change doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take all of us." Snoop nodded, his calm demeanor unwavering. "That's why I'm here," he said, "to start the conversation, to hold people accountable, and to make sure the voices that are usually ignored are finally heard." The crowd erupted into applause again, their energy now one of hope and determination. Monroe offered Snoop a small respectful nod before turning to Daniels. "Ensure this area is cleared peacefully," she instructed before walking back to her car. Daniels approached Snoop, his posture less rigid, his tone sincere. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry," he said. "I should have stepped in sooner." Snoop studied him for a moment, then offered a small nod. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said simply. The live-streamed confrontation between Snoop Dogg and Officer Moore had ignited a firestorm of debate across social media, news outlets, and community forums. The footage was shared millions of times in hashtags like Chatter Accountability, Inaction, and Chatter Change Starts. Here trended for days. Overnight, the incident became a catalyst for a nationwide discussion about policing, power, and the treatment of marginalized communities. The morning after the encounter, Snoop Dogg held a press conference on the steps of Harmony City Hall. Dressed in a sharp suit but retaining his trademark calm demeanor, he faced a sea of reporters, microphones, and cameras. Behind him, a large banner read, "Dignity for All, a Call For." Snoop stepped up to the podium, his voice carrying both strength and humility. "Yesterday wasn't about me," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. It was about shining a light on the everyday injustices that so many people face but don't have the platform to expose. It's about those who don't have the resources, the connections, or the voice to stand up for themselves. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "I wasn't out there to humiliate anyone," Snoop continued. "I was out there to test the system, a system that should protect everyone equally but often doesn't. What we saw yesterday is a symptom of a bigger issue, and it's up to all of us to fix it." The press conference sparked immediate action. Within hours, local leaders and activists joined Snoop in calling for systemic reform. Harmony Police Department released a statement committing to an internal review of its policies and practices. Captain Monroe, who had taken swift action during the incident, announced mandatory de-escalation training for all officers and the implementation of a community advisory board to ensure transparency and accountability. Activist groups organized rallies and community meetings, using the incident as a rallying cry for broader change. The park bench where Snoop had conducted his experiment became a symbolic landmark. People left flowers, notes, and even small plaques with messages of hope and unity. One note read, "This bench is where justice sat." Snoop didn't stop at the press conference. Over the following days, he met with local officials, community leaders, and youth organizations. He visited schools and shelters, using his platform to emphasize the importance of empathy, understanding, and action. During one of these visits, he sat with a group of teenagers at a community center. They were a mix of backgrounds, united by their curiosity and admiration for his bold actions. "What made you do it?" one of them asked, her voice filled with awe. "Why take the risk?" Snoop smiled, leaning forward. "Because sometimes change starts with showing people what's broken," he said. "When you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you see it, you have to do something about it." Snoop's actions also inspired everyday citizens to take a stand. At the park, volunteers organized events to support the homeless and marginalized, offering free meals, clothing, and resources. Schools incorporated discussions about systemic bias and the importance of standing up for what's right into their curriculums. A local art collective even created a mural in Harmony Square Park, featuring Snoop's silhouette sitting on the iconic bench with the words, "Your story matters," emblazoned above him. The artwork became a gathering point for conversations, protests, and celebrations. Back at the Harmony Police Department, Officer Blake Moore's career was hanging by a thread. The live-streamed footage, seen by millions, left little room for misinterpretation. Captain Jane Monroe, head of internal affairs, spearheaded a thorough investigation into Moore's conduct, both during the park incident and his prior behavior on the force. At a press conference, Captain Monroe addressed the public directly. "We are committed to holding our officers to the highest standards of integrity and accountability. The actions displayed by Officer Moore do not reflect the values of the Harmony Police Department." Moore, now stripped of his badge and weapon, was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Public condemnation came swiftly. Community leaders, activists, and even former colleagues spoke out against his actions. Protests outside the police precinct called for justice, while some demanded Moore's permanent removal from the force. Moore, for his part, retreated into silence. His anger and humiliation gave way to a quiet reflection as he watched the growing outrage unfold. The reality of his actions and the impact they had on the community began to sink in. Officer Jim Daniels, Moore's more measured partner, wasn't immune to the scrutiny. Though his actions had been far less egregious, the public questioned his complicity. "Why didn't he intervene sooner?" became a common refrain. Unlike Moore, Daniels took the criticism to heart. He attended bias training sessions organized by the department and began volunteering at local shelters and community centers. At a public forum on police reform, Daniels spoke candidly about his experience. "I failed that day," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I stood by when I should have stepped in. But I'm committed to doing better, not just for myself, but for the people I've sworn to protect." His honesty resonated with many, sparking conversations about the importance of accountability, not just for individual officers but for entire departments. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg used his platform to amplify the movement. He appeared on talk shows, podcasts, and news segments, not to boast about his actions, but to advocate for systemic change. "This isn't about one bad cop," he told an interviewer. "It's about a culture that lets this kind of behavior slide. We need more transparency, more accountability, and more empathy in how we treat each other." Snoop's words resonated deeply. Activists and community leaders reached out to collaborate on projects aimed at addressing systemic bias. His deliberate calmness and willingness to engage in tough conversations made him a respected voice in the fight for justice. Under mounting public pressure, the Harmony Police Department announced sweeping changes. These included mandatory de-escalation training. Officers were required to complete courses on de-escalation tactics and bias awareness. Community engagement programs. Officers began participating in local events to rebuild trust with residents. A new oversight board. Composed of community leaders, the board was tasked with reviewing complaints against officers and ensuring transparency. Captain Monroe addressed the reforms at a town hall meeting, where Snoop was an honored guest. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We're committed to making Harmony a place where everyone feels safe and respected." Snoop returned to the park one evening to reflect. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the mural and the now iconic bench. He sat quietly, watching as people passed by, some pausing to take pictures, others sitting for a moment of reflection. A little boy approached him, clutching a sketch pad. "Are you the guy from the bench?" he asked shyly. Snoop smiled. "Yeah, that's me." The boy handed him the sketch pad, revealing a drawing of the mural. "I drew this for you," he said. Snoop took the drawing, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, little man," he said. "This is going on my wall." As the boy ran back to his parents, Snoop leaned back on the bench, the drawing in his hands. He thought about the journey so far, the confrontation, the fallout, and the conversations it had sparked. Change was slow, but it was happening. And this was just the beginning. A few weeks after the viral incident, Harmony Square Park was buzzing with new energy. The bench where Snoop Dogg had conducted his experiment had become a symbol of change and resilience. The mural nearby now bore hundreds of signatures and messages of hope, written by visitors inspired by the story. To mark the ripple effect of the park incident, the city organized a public event in Harmony Square. It was a day to honor progress and acknowledge the need for continued effort toward equity and justice. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the aroma of food from local vendors. A stage was set up near the iconic bench, and banners reading "Your Story Matters" waved in the breeze. Snoop Dogg was the guest of honor. Dressed in a sleek black suit and his trademark sunglasses, he stepped onto the stage to the sound of cheering and applause. Standing tall, he looked out at the diverse crowd, children on their parents' shoulders, elderly couples holding hands, and groups of young activists holding signs that read, "Accountability now" and "Change starts here." "Thank you, Harmony Square," Snoop began, his voice resonating through the park. "This isn't about me. This is about us, about every person who's ever felt invisible, underestimated, or ignored. This bench might just be a piece of wood and metal, but it stands for something bigger now. It stands for every story that deserves to be heard." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy palpable. During the event, Captain Jane Monroe took the stage to announce the department's progress. She shared details about the reforms implemented since the incident, including community engagement programs and updated training protocols. "These changes are a step forward," Captain Monroe said. "But they're not the finish line. We're here to listen, to learn, and to rebuild trust with the people we serve. And that starts by acknowledging our mistakes and holding ourselves accountable." The crowd applauded, appreciating her candor. Among them was Officer Jim Daniels, now a vocal advocate for fairness in policing. Daniels had spent the weeks since the incident attending forums and working to regain the community's trust. He stood quietly in the back, nodding in agreement as Monroe spoke. After the speeches, Snoop walked through the park, shaking hands, taking selfies, and listening to the stories of those who approached him. A young mother tearfully thanked him for inspiring her son to speak out against bullying. A retired teacher told him how his actions had reignited her faith in the power of individual courage. Then, a familiar face appeared. Mrs. Patel, the elderly woman who had first thanked Snoop during the initial confrontation, approached him with a tray of homemade cookies. "I told you before, but I'll say it again," she said, her voice warm. "Thank you for reminding us all that dignity belongs to everyone." Snoop smiled and took a cookie. "And thank you, Mrs. Patel, for being part of the change." Later that evening, as the event wound down and the crowd began to thin, Snoop returned to the bench. Sitting quietly, he watched as the park lights cast a soft glow over the trees and pathways. A young boy approached him hesitantly, clutching a small notebook. "Are you Snoop Dogg?" the boy asked, wide-eyed. "That's me," Snoop said with a grin. The boy held out the notebook. "I wrote something. My teacher said we should write about someone who inspires us, and I chose you." Snoop opened the notebook and read the neatly written words. The boy had written about how Snoop's actions had taught him to stand up for what's right and believe in himself. It was simple, but heartfelt. "You've got talent, little man," Snoop said, handing the notebook back. "Keep writing, and don't let anyone tell you your voice doesn't matter." The boy beamed as he ran back to his parents. The following days brought more visitors to the park. People came not just to see the bench, but to reflect on its meaning. Schools brought students on field trips to learn about the power of standing up for justice. Community leaders hosted dialogues about equity and accountability near the mural. The bench, once an ordinary seat, had become a beacon of hope. Meanwhile, Snoop continued his advocacy, working with organizations to push for broader reforms. At a press conference in another city, he reiterated his message. This was just one moment, one park, one confrontation. But it showed us something important, that change starts when we decide to care. It starts when we choose to act. On a quiet morning weeks later, Snoop returned to Harmony Square Park, this time without cameras or crowds. He sat on the bench, the one that had become a symbol of transformation. As the sun rose over the city, casting its golden light across the park, he closed his eyes and smiled. The work was far from over, but the first steps had been taken, and those steps, he knew, were the hardest but most important of all. Thank you for watching this heartfelt journey of love, resilience, and forgiveness. If this story inspired you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories that remind us of the power of humanity. Don't forget to share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. See you in the next video.